No goodbye, no note, no phone call to her daughter, no trace left behind except the kind of quiet that only comes after something goes terribly wrong. Nancy Guthrie was a grandmother. She had routines. She had people who depended on hearing her voice. She had a life that, by every account from those who knew her, was steady and full and ordinary in all the ways that matter most. And then one day, that life just stopped making noise. When the people closest to her started asking questions, they hit walls. When they pushed harder, things didn't add up. But what nobody expected, what almost nobody could have been prepared for, was where the suspicion would eventually land. Not on a stranger, not on someone from the outer edges of her world, but on someone who sat at her dinner table, someone who called her family, her son-in-law, that name, that connection, that accusation. It changed everything about how this story was told. Because when someone inside a family becomes a suspect, the grief doesn't just come from the disappearance anymore. It comes from something deeper. The realization that danger sometimes wears the most familiar face in the room. That the person you had no reason to fear may have been the one you needed to fear most. Investigators have raised serious questions. The community around Nancy has been shaken in ways it hasn't fully recovered from. And somewhere beneath all of it, a woman named Nancy Guthrie is still missing, her fate unknown. Her story still unfolding in ways that no one who loves her is ready to accept. This is what we know, and this is what we're still waiting to understand. There are people in every small community who hold things together without ever being asked to. They show up when they're needed. They remember the birthdays that everyone else forgets. They check on their neighbors not because they feel obligated, but because that's simply who they are. They are, in the quietest and most genuine sense, the kind of people who make a place feel like home. Nancy Guthrie was one of those people. By the accounts of those who knew her well, she was deeply woven into her family's daily life. Her daughter was a constant presence in her world. Her grandchildren, they carried a piece of her heart everywhere they went, whether they knew it or not. There's a particular kind of tenderness that exists between a grandmother and her grandchildren. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't need to. It's patient. It's unconditional. It asks for nothing in return. That, by all accounts, was exactly who Nancy was. She lived with a sense of routine, the kind that takes years to build, small habits, familiar places, the same faces in the same spaces, over and over, until those rhythms become something close to identity. The people who knew her described a woman who was reliable in the truest sense of that word, not just dependable in small moments, but consistently, quietly present in the emotional fabric of her family's life, present in a way you only notice when it's gone. That's what made her absence feel so wrong so quickly. When she stopped responding, people noticed. When she couldn't be reached, the concern turned urgent. When the people who fully expected to hear from her heard nothing instead, they didn't wait long. Because this wasn't Nancy, not answering, not calling, not checking in. That simply wasn't something she did. Not without a word. Not without some signal, however small, that she was okay. The days that followed her disappearance brought the kind of dread that moves through a family slowly at first, and then all at once. In the beginning, maybe there was still room for a rational explanation. Maybe she needed some space. Maybe something had come up and she'd reach out soon. People tell themselves these things, not because they truly believe them, but because the alternative is too heavy to carry before you absolutely have to. But as the silence stretched on, that weight became unavoidable, and the rational explanations started to run out. According to reports, concern for Nancy escalated quickly into something far more serious. Those closest to her began speaking to authorities. Investigators began asking the kinds of questions that signal a situation has moved beyond a simple missing persons case. The kind of questions that mean someone, somewhere, believes something is very wrong. The community around her began to pay attention in that way communities do, when one of their own has vanished without a trace. And through all of it, one question kept surfacing. Quiet at first, then impossible to ignore. Where was Nancy? And who was the last person to see her? The answers to those questions would eventually push investigators toward a direction that no one in her family wanted to consider, because the picture that began taking shape wasn't the one anyone had braced themselves for. It was more complicated than that, more painful, and it was far, far closer to home. Nancy Guthrie did not live at the margins of her own story. She was at the center of it, the center of her family's life, of her grandchildren's mornings, of the small daily world she had built with such care over so many years. She was not someone who faded into the background. She was someone people leaned toward. From what has been reported, the bonds she maintained with her family were genuine and constant. Her daughter was not just a daughter, she was a central pillar of Nancy's day-to-day existence. And those grandchildren, the relationship between a grandmother and her grandchildren carries a weight that's hard to describe to someone who hasn't felt it. It's quieter than the love between parents and children, but in many ways it runs even deeper. It's love with the urgency taken out of it, unhurried, unguarded, and completely sure of itself. That was Nancy in the people who mattered to her most. Her son-in-law had, over time, become part of that same fabric. He was married to her daughter. That made him family by every conventional definition. He was someone she saw regularly, someone she knew, someone whose presence in her home and in her life was expected and unremarkable. There was access. There was familiarity. There was the kind of closeness that comes not from deep personal connection necessarily, but from proximity, from simply being woven into the same daily life for long enough that no one thinks twice about it. And then everything changed. The exact details of what happened in the period leading up to Nancy's disappearance are still being investigated. According to reports, what is known is that at some point, contact simply ceased. The woman who had always been reachable became unreachable. The woman who had always shown up didn't. There was no graceful fade, no explanation, no warning, just a stop, sudden and complete, that the people who loved her felt immediately in their bones. When family members began raising alarms, the search for answers began in earnest. But what emerged as investigators looked more carefully at the days and hours before her disappearance started to cast a shadow somewhere no one had expected, over someone they had trusted without question. The investigation was only beginning, and it was going somewhere no one in that family was ready to go. There's a specific kind of unease that takes hold in an investigation like this. It begins with confusion, with the desperate, almost physical need for a simple explanation. And then, slowly, that confusion curls into something darker. Because the story being told starts to show its cracks. The pieces don't fit the way they should. And the questions that were once manageable start multiplying. According to reports, as investigators looked more closely at the circumstances of Nancy's disappearance, things began to emerge about the timeline, about what happened in the hours before she was last seen, about who was near her, about who knew where she was and when. In missing persons cases, law enforcement routinely turns first to those closest to the individual, not as an accusation, but as a starting point. The people who knew someone's routines, who had access to their home, who understood the patterns of their daily life, they are always among the first to face questions. In Nancy's case, that scrutiny landed heavily on her son-in-law. Investigators raised questions about the nature of the relationship between them. According to reports, there are suggestions that things inside the family were not entirely what they appeared from the outside. What exactly the nature of that tension was has not been fully detailed publicly. But the presence of any conflict, even unspoken conflict, even the kind that no one names aloud, changes the shape of an investigation in ways that matter. It becomes a thread, and investigators pull at threads. What made the situation almost unbearable was what it meant for Nancy's daughter. She was caught between two unbearable things at once: the fear for her mother and the reality of her life with the man she had chosen to marry. There is no clean answer in that position. There is no way to move through it without something breaking. It is just grief stacked on top of grief, with no clear floor beneath it. As the investigation continued, accounts from those questioned reportedly began to show inconsistencies. Not everything aligned the way it should. Not every answer settled the questions being asked. And each gap in the timeline, each moment that couldn't be accounted for in any innocent way, added weight to the growing suspicion that Nancy's disappearance was not accidental, that someone knew more than they were telling, that the answers, if they existed, were somewhere very close. There is something uniquely devastating about the moment a family member, becomes the focus of a criminal investigation, it doesn't just change how investigators look at that person. It changes how everyone in that orbit looks at everything. According to reports, investigators work to build a fuller picture of the dynamics at play within the household, within the extended family, in the spaces where tensions might have lived. They spoke to people. They gathered records. They worked to understand not just what may have happened, but why, what the nature of the relationship between Nancy and her son-in-law really was, beneath the surface of family dinners and ordinary occasions. The portrait that was beginning to take shape was not a comfortable one. And through all of it, Nancy was still missing. The investigation continued. The community held its breath, and the people who loved her waited for someone to bring her home. In investigations like this, the emotional and the procedural rarely move at the same pace. While the family was living inside their fear, the desperate hope, the sleepless nights, the grief that has nowhere to go, law enforcement was doing something entirely different. They were methodical. They were quiet. They were following evidence wherever it led, regardless of how difficult the destination. And according to reports, the evidence kept leading in one direction. Investigators reportedly examined communications, movements, and statements with increasing intensity. Because that's how these things work when a story doesn't hold up, when timelines crack under pressure, when explanations don't match what the physical evidence suggests. Investigators notice. They don't let it go. They ask the same questions different ways over and over, and they wait to see which details start to shift. In this case, according to reports, details did shift. It isn't possible to say precisely here what investigators found or how far the evidence went, because much of this case, at the time of this account, remains active and not fully disclosed to the public. What has been reported is that the focus on the son-in-law deepened, that the actions taken by authorities were consistent with treating him as a central figure, perhaps the central figure, in what happened to Nancy. What makes this case so particularly difficult to sit with is the position Nancy herself was in. She wasn't taken from a parking lot by someone she'd never seen before. She wasn't a random target. If the suspicions investigators have raised are accurate, then she was a woman who was allegedly taken by someone whose face she knew, someone whose footsteps in her hallway she wouldn't have questioned. That kind of violation, the betrayal of ordinary familiarity, carries a weight that's different from other kinds of harm. It is the horror of safety becoming a lie, of trust being the thing that made someone vulnerable. For Nancy's daughter, the emotional reality of this is almost impossible to hold in the mind all at once. To be looking for your mother while also having to reckon with the possibility that the person sleeping in the same house as you might be responsible. That is not a burden anyone is built to carry. And yet that is exactly where this case had arrived. Cases like Nancy Guthrie's don't resolve cleanly. They don't move in straight lines toward clear answers. They double back. They reveal new layers just when you think you've understood the shape of them. They ask the people involved, investigators, family, the community watching from a careful distance, to sit with deep uncertainty for longer than anyone wants to. As scrutiny on the son-in-law grew, so did the complexity of the questions surrounding this case. What was the actual nature of the conflict, if there was one? What were the specific circumstances that allegedly led to Nancy's disappearance? Was there a particular moment, a confrontation, a decision, a line crossed that set everything in motion? Investigators have not publicly disclosed all of what they know. That's standard in active investigations. But what has been reported has been enough to hold this story in the public's attention, to keep the questions alive. In a way that hasn't faded, there is something this case quietly illuminates about how families carry secrets, about how people can live in close proximity for years and still not fully know what someone else is capable of, about how love, the love that binds families together, can be used against people, can be counted on to create hesitation, can be wielded by someone who understands exactly how much it costs others to believe the worst about them. Nancy's son-in-law, if the investigative focus and reported accusations carry truth, understood that dynamic in a way that is difficult to reconcile. He was inside the family. He was trusted without much question. He knew the rhythms of Nancy's life because he had been living alongside them. That access, that familiarity, according to reports, It is part of what has drawn investigators so firmly in his direction, and yet, no verdict has been reached. No guilt has been established in a court of law. The matter remains under investigation. The outcome is not yet written. What is written, and what cannot be undone, is the fact that Nancy Guthrie is still missing, that her grandchildren are growing older without her in the room, that her daughter is carrying something no child should ever have to carry, that a community is waiting for some version of justice, or answers, or closure, for something that begins to make sense of what happened to a woman who, by all accounts, deserved none of this. The silence where Nancy used to be is still there, and it is deafening. Stories like this one stay with us long after we've finished telling them, not because they're exceptional in the landscape of human tragedy, but because they're ordinary in the most unsettling way, because they remind us, quietly and insistently, that the most dangerous moments in a life don't always arrive with a warning. Sometimes they arrive in the form of a Sunday afternoon, a familiar laugh, a face you've looked at 100 times without fear, a relationship that was supposed to mean safety. Nancy Guthrie was a grandmother. She was a mother. She was someone's neighbor, someone's friend, someone's reason to pick up the phone. She was real in the fullest sense of that word. Not a case number, not a headline, not a story to fill time, but a person with a history and a future that was supposed to go on. When someone like Nancy disappears, the loss doesn't stay contained. It moves outward. Her grandchildren will carry this. Her daughter will carry this. Every person who sat at a table with her, who heard her laugh, who depended on her being there in the ordinary ways we depend on the people we love. They carry something too. They carry the weight of not knowing, that particular, agonizing absence of an answer that would let them grieve properly, and mourn fully, and eventually find some fragile form of peace. That kind of grief doesn't follow a schedule. It doesn't resolve when the calendar says it should. It lives in the gaps between ordinary moments, in a quiet Tuesday morning, in the smell of something familiar, in the unconscious reflex to reach for the phone and call someone who isn't there anymore to pick up. The investigation into what happened to Nancy Guthrie reflects something important about how justice moves when the situation is complicated, when the accused is someone close, when the evidence is layered and the emotions of everyone involved are running too high to be ignored. Law enforcement, in cases like this, carries a responsibility that goes beyond solving a crime. It carries the responsibility of truth, of not rushing, of not letting pressure shape a conclusion before the evidence is ready to support one, of following the facts even when the facts are slow and uncomfortable. And for those of us on the outside, watching, waiting, holding some piece of this story in our minds, there's a responsibility to resist the ease of a simple narrative, to hold the uncertainty without filling it with things we don't actually know, to remember that at the center of this story, beyond the investigation and the suspicion and the questions that may take a long time to answer, there is a woman, a real woman, one who is loved, one who is missed, one who deserves to be found. That no official conclusion has been reached. The investigation is ongoing, and the name Nancy Guthrie belongs before anything else, not to a case or a news cycle or a documentary script, but to a family that is still waiting, still hoping, still holding space for the possibility that she comes home. Some questions don't get answered on our timeline. Some stories don't end the way we need them to, but they deserve to be told, carefully, honestly, with the full weight of what they carry. And this one is no different. If this story stayed with you, sit with it for a moment. Cases like Nancy's deserve more than a passing scroll. They deserve our attention, our empathy, and our willingness to ask the harder questions, the ones about family and trust and what happens when the two come apart. If you have thoughts on what justice looks like in a situation this complicated, leave them in the comments. And if stories told this way mean something to you, consider subscribing. Every case covered here is handled with care, with the people at the center of it always kept in mind. Nancy's story isn't over, and neither is the commitment to telling it with the respect it deserves.